Welcome, everybody. Glad to have you in class today. It's an exciting topic that we're going to dive into today. And my name's Curry Sautner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the National Constitution Center. And I'll be here with you asking Tom, one of our top scholars at the National Constitution Center, a million questions about the presidency. But I prefer to ask your questions. So in the chat, open it up, ask questions as we go through, ask for clarification, and also share ideas. A lot of our students are super knowledgeable or have questions about what's going on and they share different things in the chat. We love that. We encourage it, share away. So Tom, we want to say welcome to all the students today before we get started.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. Can't wait to talk about the presidency.
We're going to talk about the presidency. We're going to ask Tom lots of questions. So let's begin with those questions. So Tom, here's like kind of the ticking list from start to finish almost in the timeline. First of all, let's talk about what's the role and the job of the presidency. Sometimes we have this thing that happens in America where we talk about somebody's job, but we never really clearly know what the role and the job is. And so let's begin with what is the job of the presidency and where does the president get the power from the Constitution? That's kind of the key rule that you teach us in every class. Look to the Constitution and where the Constitution affords power or limits to that role of the government. So we're going to ask that too. Where does it get its power? Maybe we'll add in there where are some limits on the presidency. What do the founding generation think and worry about the presidency when framing the Article 2 of the Constitution? How has the job changed over time? And then everybody's favorite topic when we're talking about the presidency, can we talk about executive orders, what they are and how they've changed over time too? So do you think we can do all that in about 25, 30 minutes?
Absolutely.
Cool. Okay, so let's get started. You want to start with the Constitution where we always like to begin?
Absolutely. Let's start with the text of the Constitution. And just as a reminder, in the Constitution, Articles 1 through 3 set up the framework of the national government. So Article 1, it establishes the legislative branch, Congress, which makes the laws. Then Article 3 establishes the federal court system headed by a Supreme Court charged with interpreting the laws. And then it's the article in between those two, Article 2, which sets up the executive branch led by a single president tasked with enforcing the laws. Article 2 starts by vesting what's called the executive power of the United States in a single president. And it's amazing how much scholarship, how many Supreme Court opinions, how many political fights are over those two words, executive power, and what's actually, what sort of power flows into that phrase. But the Article 2 sets up a lot of other things, tells us a lot of other things about the presidency. It sets out the details of how we elect a president. So we use the Electoral College. It sets out how we might remove a president from office. That's the process of impeachment and removal. And it lists some of the president's core powers and responsibilities. And if you read Article 1 with Congress and Article 2 with the president, you'll see Article 2 is a bit shorter than Congress. There's not quite as many powers listed in there, but the powers given to the presidency are still very important. So Curry, what are some of the really important powers here? Well, it's the president's role as commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States, so giving the president important power to lead our military forces. It's the power to appoint judges and executive branch officials with the advice and consent of the Senate. It's the power to make treaties. So this is the president's ability to make agreements with other governments. Remember, when we established this new national government, part of what the framers wanted to do was to ensure we had one part of our government, one part of us that allowed us to speak as one people on the world stage. And here, the treaty power and the president's power here is helping our nation speak with one voice. The president can make treaties, but provided 2/3 of the senators approve of those treaties. The president has the power to grant pardons, so to excuse people for instance, possibly breaking the laws. And finally, the president has a duty there, a duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. This is a powerful statement, Curry, of our commitment in this country that everyone has to follow the law, that no one, not even the president of the United States, is above the law, and that here it's a reminder that the president's core function is to enforce the laws and to make sure that they are faithfully executed. So those are some of the powers, but also, as we know, the president is limited in certain ways by the Constitution, by, in many ways, that principle of checks and balances. And so the president here, the president has a check of the president's own. So the president has the power to veto laws that are passed by Congress. So Congress can pass a law. The law then comes to the president's desk, and the president has the power to say yes or no. But even that power alone has a check in place. where Congress has the power to override or cancel the president's veto by a 2/3 vote in both houses of Congress. Another important check on the presidency is that any action taken by the presidency can come before the Supreme Court, can come before the federal court system, and the federal courts can review that action of the president and say that it was either constitutional or unconstitutional. That's that important power of judicial review that we lodge in the court system. I'll sort of pause there, Curry, but those are some of the really big, that's the big framework that we see in Article 2 for the presidency.
And I think that really helps spell out, like when we look at every single branch, we dive into it, we say, where are the powers? And then how do checks and balances put limits on that branch as well? So it really spells out the balance between all of these branches. And also, I love the take care clause, like that take care right there. So it explains so much why the president would have the veto power. So to take care that the laws are faithfully executed, but also to ensure that they're laws that uphold the Constitution. And if the president does not think that they're right, they can veto it. Now they can get overridden, but it is a part of that power to be a check on the Constitution and on the laws should follow the Constitution. So I think that's really interesting. We can never look at these branches in isolation, but always in the system that they're in, and that they are all working together and in a nice way at odds with each other. And that is a part of the tension of the entire system. So I think that's really, really important as we go through and kind of look through this. Now, that Constitution and kind of spelling out presidential actions, the Supreme Court can check it, the president can veto. Have there been any edits or changes to the Constitution, the Article 2, which was 1787, since 1787 in the Constitution?
Yeah, there are a number of amendments that we've made over time. So for instance, one of the first amendments to the Constitution, the 12th Amendment, changed the Electoral College, so made revisions to how we elect the president. The 20th Amendment, a lot of people forget it, but it sort of shortened the amount of time between an election and when the president takes office. So it used to be March, we moved it to January. With the 22nd Amendment, in many ways, that's the most important one. It sets a limit on the number of times that the president can be re-elected. So George Washington, in many ways, set so many important precedents for the presidency as our nation's first president. One of the big ones was that he decided to leave office after his second term. Every president from Washington until FDR followed this precedent. Until FDR broke it, he was reelected 4 times. And then once he did that, in 1951, we the people said, no, we like the way George Washington did it better. So we wrote George Washington's precedent into the Constitution with the 22nd Amendment.
And we teach this, so if everybody doesn't know, Tom and I teach this class on Tuesdays at University of Pennsylvania, and it's about the Constitution in the classroom. And what I loved about it is the students actually brought up this amendment and said that we had norms in our society that a president would stay in office for 2 terms. And then one president broke the norms and the people called for an amendment to be changing it to put the norms into the Constitution. And I just thought it was really interesting because so many of our students and our people that are joining us have norms that they have for their family, for their classroom. And then how do we have a constitutional amendment, validate and hold on to a norm that we believe in? So just wanted to add that kind of fun side note around the 22nd Amendment. Okay, so let's get really tactical. Some of our students want to run for president. How can they do it? Help them get there.
Yeah, so I mean, the main thing, the main requirement for the presidency is that you have to be 35 years old. So that's one thing to keep in mind is you have to be 35 years old, a natural born citizen of the United States, a resident of the United States for 14 years. And so, in terms of running for President, Curry, it's a small number of job requirements. And then we have, again, you would have to run for president and you would have to succeed in the system that we have in place, which is the Electoral College. So the Electoral College is this system in which we, the people, vote on election day for a certain set of electors that then meet in December and ultimately select the president of the United States. It ends up closely approximating, usually, a popular direct vote. But as we know, sometimes presidents can win the Electoral College even if they've lost the popular vote nationwide. So it's sort of a compromise between, at the founding at least, it was a compromise between a system where you have the direct popular vote by the people on election day versus a president being selected by Congress. Those are the 2 big ideas that were before the convention. So they settled on the Electoral College as a compromise.
And we're going to dive into that even more and kind of what they thought would happen as the president was elected after Washington, because we all know that they were like, oh, we got Washington, check, first president's in, we'll figure it out from there. But before we get into that, and one more beat on where in the Constitution do you find talk and discussions around the presidency removing a president from office? And there's been some amendments around that. So if a president is ill, and how does that actually work? So do you want to touch on Article 2 real quickly, Section 4, and then dive into the 25th Amendment?
Sure. So Article 2, Section 4 sets out sort of the standard for impeachment. We have this impeachment and removal process. So a president can be removed from office if convicted of in an impeachment trial of, quote, treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. You'd have to look to Article 1 to get the mechanics of the process. So it's the House of Representatives that impeaches or formally accuses the president, and the House can do that with just a majority vote. And then the Senate has the power to hold an impeachment trial and decide whether or not to remove the president. And there, the threshold's pretty high. It requires a 2/3 vote of the Senate. So it's going to require a pretty broad consensus among senators for our own times, a consensus that often transcends party lines. In order to remove a president from office, only 3 presidents have been impeached. So that's Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump. And no president has ever been removed by the Senate as part of this process, though, of course, President Nixon resigned from office before he could be impeached. And Andrew Johnson was within a single vote of being removed from office during Reconstruction.
Amazing. Do you remember who was that single vote? Just wondering.
It's John F. Kennedy writes about him in his Profiles of Courage book. I forget the person's name, but the thing is, once it's one vote, a lot of people end up being the decisive vote in practice. And if you want a really great book on President Johnson's impeachment that's really, really readable, David O. Stewart's book, Impeached, is an excellent book on the Johnson impeachment.
Ooh, we love books. We love reading. Okay, so now that we've kind of gone through all these different sections of the Constitution, what it talks about the president, where you can find parts about the president, how many terms, age, all those pieces. Let's dive into, is that what they were thinking in the beginning? So summer of 1787, they all come together and they start with Article 1 in Congress. They write the most on Congress. They take the most amount of time on it. But the presidency is something that they talk about a lot, and they're at odds with each other at times. So tell us the story about how do they figure out how to get a president? Coming from being so scared and so fearful of a king, and then going to the Articles of Confederation where, there is no real one main leader. They've learned so many lessons. How did they come to this in-between idea and having a presidency?
Yeah, so they really, really struggled with the presidency. There was a way in which they had some sense of what they wanted Congress to look like. But with the presidency, the delegates at the convention, really, they couldn't find an example of what they were looking for in the real world. And so they looked to Europe, they saw powerful kings, they looked to their own state constitutions in their states, and they saw really, really weak governors. And so neither one of those examples really worked for them. They wanted something in between. At the same time, they were really, really, really worried about executive power. And it's really easy to see why. Remember, they just fought a revolution to cast off King George III. They remembered the abuses of his royal officials, his royal governors in America, and they didn't want to replicate that under the new system of government. And so they really struggled with different visions of the presidency. So at the convention, you have figures like Alexander Hamilton, who actually thought the monarchy had a lot going for it. He really admired many features of the limited monarchy of Great Britain. In many ways, would have been happy if we elected a president for life. So it's effectively something like an elective monarch. On the flip side, we have people like Connecticut's Roger Sherman, who would forge important compromises at the convention, like the Great Compromise, helping to set up Congress. Well, he looked at the presidency and he said, I don't want a powerful president. I want a weak president and a strong Congress. The president's just there to carry out what we, Congress, say. And so with Sherman, you get this vision of a government that's really driven by Congress. And so you have sort of these polar opposites there at the convention itself. The last thing to note is, in the larger sense, the delegates were most concerned about an all-powerful Congress. It was their assumption that Congress would be the most important branch, that it would be the most powerful branch. That's why they spent more time at the convention debating Congress than really any other part of the government. And so with the executive, they were looking for someone that could be independent enough to check congressional abuses. So they thought Congress would be the most powerful branch, but they did want to ensure that they had a presidency that could be an independent check through the systems of check and balances to make sure that Congress didn't abuse its power. And so they come into the convention, they have a series of debates, and what they notice is as they tick through a lot of the big issues at the convention, they notice that these issues are really interconnected. And so they sort of go back and forth in ideas and notice that as they change their views about one of these issues, they might change their views on another. And so the four big issues that they debated, Curry, were how are they going to elect this president? How long should the president's term be? Should the president be allowed to run for re-election? And how should the president be removed from office? How might we remove a president from office during their term, say if they were abusing the powers of their office? So this question of impeachment and removal. And, in many ways, to encapsulate this debate, just think about one of the first debates that the delegates had over the presidency. It was near the beginning of the convention, and the delegates debated, do we want the executive power of the United States to all flow into one person? Do we want a single president at the head of this executive branch with the power to execute the laws and the power really to run this whole new executive branch? And this may be a weird question for us to think of today because we take the American presidency for granted. It's the big symbol of our national government today. And we must think, of course, you're only going to have one president. How could the government possibly work well if you have multiple presidents? So you limit the president in a certain way. There's a value in the executive branch having a single decider that can act swiftly, sometimes to defend the nation, sometimes to carry out the laws. But this was a debate, a heated debate at the beginning of the convention. And so in many ways, Curry, the key voice on behalf of the presidency that we have today, that single president being vested with the executive power, was Pennsylvania's James Wilson. And so he stands up near the beginning of the convention. And he argues, quote, that the executive consists of a single person. We need a single president. That's the only way that we can create an executive branch that's going to properly check Congress. But needless to say, there were other delegates who said, Mr. Wilson, that is dangerous. What you were talking about sounds like a king. And so we have, again, Roger Sherman gets up and he says, no, we don't have to figure out any of the details right now. Let's say that there's going to be an executive branch. We even say that there's going to be a president, but let's leave all of the details to Congress. And now, again, this may seem like a ridiculous notion to us today, but this is effectively what the delegates did with the federal courts. Article 3 says very, very little and basically says, Congress, you figure out the rest. And Roger Sherman is saying for the presidency, we should do the same thing, and Congress should have power to shape that branch. More powerfully, it's the delegate, Virginia's Edmund Randolph, who was one of the most powerful delegates at the convention, one of the most powerful political figures in America. He looks at Mr. Wilson and he says, my goodness, if we lodge all of the executive power in a single person, the presidency would become, quote, the fetus of monarchy. Once you put all that power in one person with the energy of the executive, we're on the path to King George III. We just fought a revolution to get off that path. We do not want to get on that path again. Mr. Wilson, what on earth are you talking about? To which Wilson replies, well, I hear what you're saying, Mr. Randolph. There are dangers in a lot of power going into one person in the executive branch, but what we can do if we get the Constitution right, we can combine the virtues of a powerful king. So this idea of energy, this idea of a single person being able to execute the laws, help keep our nation safe and get stuff done. Enough talking. Sometimes you just need someone to get stuff done. We can get that energy from a single president. But at the same time, because we're creating a Republican government, there will be checks in place. This president will be held accountable in many ways by giving all of this power to one person. They are the most visible form of government. Congress can check the president, and eventually elections can check the president. And we see many of these arguments, Curry, eventually reflected in Alexander Hamilton's famous Federalist Paper essay number 78, laying out the vision of the presidency that the founders put in place. But eventually, Mr. Wilson convinces the convention, yes, single presidency, unitary executive power flowing into one person. But I think that debate, more than anything, Curry, it establishes sort of the dividing lines between the different sides, sort of this broader vision of what the presidency can bring to the government, but also some of the dangers that the framers saw in this new presidency.
Yeah, I think this is so fascinating because you can see all their experiences and how it's making them see value and danger in every action of it. But it does start on the premise of them really believing how much power Congress would have and how much power Congress could exert on the presidency if they did get out of control or they did get out of hand. And that Congress would act as a unified team in checking the other branches. So I think that's kind of interesting how that works and how that plays out. The other piece of it too is we're talking a different time period. How much did it matter that, you know, if it was multiple people, that the presidency wouldn't be, they'd have to gather and then they have to talk things out and then they have to be able to figure things out. So if they did have a three-headed presidency, how much did it matter of the time period and transportation and all those pieces?
Well, some of it are practical logistics like that. Part of it too is like so many of these figures at the convention have been in so many different frankly, just like committees over time of doing stuff. And so it's both the practicalities of people moving, but they also know like we've gathered together in small committees doing stuff. It just takes some time. And so there are just certain areas in which we think the government has to be able to act with speed. And so because of that, having a single president has much to speak for it.
And I think that's really important because balancing again was their goal. So Congress is slow and we'll have, a spillover effect that is a good thing and will slow things down. We want the president to be agile and fast and be able to move at a quicker pace. So that makes complete sense. Now, a big part of their debate that you said was how to elect a president, how long the president would stay. So can you kind of take us a walkthrough of the Electoral College? And again, how they came up with this system for the presidency?
Yeah, so, this is one of those debates where the delegates would go to it, they'd come to some sort of conclusion, they'd leave it, and then they'd come back to it, and they agree to disagree over and over again. And ultimately, Curry, what they debated were, on the one hand, James Wilson said, what we should really have is some sort of national election, some sort of direct popular vote. It sounds very modern in that sense. Not many people agreed with him, but he sort of staked out this position that the American people have to have a direct say in who their president's going to be. On the flip side, most of the delegates really wanted a president that was selected by Congress. And so the convention many different times said, no, the president's going to be selected by Congress. But the concern there, again, is if Congress is the all-powerful branch, well, then we have a president that's dependent on Congress. Will we actually have checks in place to ensure that Congress doesn't abuse its power and also to ensure that the president continues to exert power in an independent way? Ultimately, they settled, Curry, on this system of the Electoral College where, again, it's sort of the way it left a lot of questions, a lot of the details actually to the states to figure out how the Electoral College would work over time. But the way it works today is, voters in America, they go to vote on election day, they go to the polls, they vote for the presidency. And technically what they're voting for there is a slate of electors really from the political party of their president that will then meet together in a body, the Electoral College, in December and cast votes. Each state has a number of electors that equals the number of members of Congress that it has. So we add up the number of representatives in the House of Representatives and their two senators to get the number of electoral votes for that individual state. So here you see Pennsylvania, 17 House members, 2 senators, so they get 19 electoral votes. And whoever wins a majority in the Electoral College becomes president.
And, as we kind of think through this, you have this, unlike what Roger Sherman wanted, it's removed, it's far separated from, vote, that's us voting or the people that can vote in our country, and then for the electors and then to the presidency directly. And it has this kind of weighted system across the states. Now, there's a lot of other kind of ways that it can be broken up within the states or in a winner-take-all system as well. So we have a little bit of difference between the states. But was this just to appease all the different ideas around it? Was it really to say, okay, you want direct election, they're not ready for that. You want Congress to pick it. Here's some kind of like in between. Like, what was the purpose of having this multi-step system?
Yeah, I mean, in part, it was a compromise in between those two sides. So if you're James Wilson and you want a direct popular vote, he thinks this is the closest he's going to get to it. Because his assumption is that over time, if we leave this in the hands of the states, the people who are very close to their state governments are going to demand a voice in presidential elections, and the states are going to grant that. And effectively, that is what the states have done over time. So there's a very direct connection between how voters vote on election day and how their states decide on their electoral votes. So that's one piece. For those who support a congressional election, Their assumption was that after George Washington, we weren't going to have many figures that commanded a national reputation. And so that many people who run for president are not going to be able to get a majority of the electoral college. If that's the case, then the election under the Constitution is sent to the House of Representatives. So they thought that they would get a congressional election by other means.
Got it. So we've kind of framed where the presidency is in the Constitution and where the power is set. And then we framed how, what were the debates around Congress, one person, multiple people, checks and balances, how that is voted, the president is voted in. We've got about 5 minutes left. Should we get to the trickiest part of talking about the president today? I feel like we barely talk about the president. What we always talk about is executive orders. That seems to be the hot topic when talking about the presidency. So can you help us define what is an executive order? Where do they come from? And then what's the big debate today around them?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, in the broader sense, Curry, when we look at the presidency, when we look at executive orders, we're asking a simple question from a constitutional perspective. And that's, does the president have the power to do what the president wants to do? Can the president do that? And so what we always are looking to do is we're looking for what is the source of legal authority that the president is drawing on to do what the president wants to do. It could be in the Constitution. It could be in a law passed by Congress. But in the end, as with many other parts of the Constitution, we want to ask, where is the president's power coming from? So executive orders are simply a piece of paper that the president signs telling somebody in the executive branch to do something. That's basically all it is. It's a written directive. It's a piece of paper that says, Treasury Secretary, do X. And so these executive orders, there's no executive order clause of the Constitution or anything like that, but they're rooted in the president's role leading the executive branch and the president's duty to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. The president uses executive orders to serve as the boss of the executive branch and to tell other people what to do. Executive orders go all the way back to George Washington. So a very simple and basic example is Washington used executive order saying, cabinet officials, executive branch officials, can you write me some reports about what you've been up to? So that's an example of very basic executive order. But they've also been used, for instance, by President Harry S. Truman to desegregate the armed forces of the United States. They could be very small things that you would expect any boss of a company to do, or really, really big things that transform the military of the United States and America's promise of equality. They could do but Curry, the reason they become topics of debate is the arguments are often that presidents use executive orders to stretch the powers that are given to them, that they're asking often executive officials to do things that the president can't get Congress to pass laws to do. And so the debates often turn on, within those executive orders, is the president abusing the authority that they've been given under the Constitution and the laws of the nation or not?
And that was Uriel's point in the chat was, are the presidents doing that because Congress isn't passing the law? So I think this Youngstown, and I know we have 1 minute left, but I think this is an interesting case because when I first read it, I thought that this would fall squarely under the role of the presidency, that President Truman should be allowed to do this, in charge of the armed forces. It's in a time of war. But as you parse out the story, then you start to see, well, nope, the power isn't there. It should be there. So could you tell us really quickly the story of the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company?
Yeah, so this is the famed steel seizure case. It's the Korean War. Harry S. Truman's president. And steel workers want to go on strike. There's a big conflict between the steel workers and the employers, but we're at war. And so what Harry S. Truman says is, I'm the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of the United States under Article 2. Steel is a really, really important thing that we need in order to win a war. As the commander-in-chief, I have the power to do things necessary to win a conflict. So what I'm going to do is, with my independent constitutional authority, I'm going to seize these steel mills and make sure steel production continues so that we can fight and win the Korean War. So he thinks he's in the core of his constitutional powers. There hasn't been a law passed by Congress saying that he can do this, but he's saying, no, the Constitution is the law here. That's all I need. And he expects to win. So the Supreme Court is filled with justices that either he appointed or his predecessor and political ally FDR appointed. So he's expecting to win in wartime, but ultimately the Supreme Court says, no, President Truman, you're wrong in a 6-3 decision. And so what the majority says there, it's a majority opinion written by Justice Hugo Black, is the basic thing that, President, what you're doing, you're acting in an area where Congress hasn't given you authorization. You don't have an independent authority to act in this context. So what you're doing is unconstitutional. If you want to do this, go to Congress and get Congress to pass a law. In many ways, Curry, the most important opinion in this case, though, is an opinion by Justice Robert Jackson. It's his concurring opinion, which simply means he was part of the court's majority, but he writes a separate opinion to say, look, this is a really hard issue. Let me give you some thoughts as to how I analyze it. And so what he does is he separates situations like this into 3 different categories. And within these categories, they lead to different forms of analysis. So the first category is when the president acts with congressional approval, he has the maximum authority to act. The second category is that when he acts in the face of congressional disapproval, he has the least authority to act. And so this is what Justice Jackson famously says, presidential power is at its, quote, lowest ebb. So it's when the president's acting and Congress has disapproved. The last is where Congress has neither approved nor disapproved of the president's actions. The president then acts in what he calls a zone of twilight. So this is somewhere in between those 2 situations. But the big idea here, Curry, is that when we're looking at a president's actions and trying to figure out whether they're constitutional or unconstitutional, that the president's power is going to be at its strongest when it's acting arm in arm with Congress. And it's going to be at its lowest or its weakest when the president says one thing and Congress says another. It's not to say the president will always lose in those situations, but it's when the president's power is at its lowest ebb. And again, the big point is when the president acts, we want to ask, where is the president getting the legal authority to act? Is it the Constitution? Is it a law passed by Congress? Is it an opinion of the courts? Where is the power coming from? And even if the president can point to that source of power, is the president's action consistent with other parts of the Constitution, like the Bill of Rights or other parts that place limits on each branch of government?
And Tom, that is a perfect summary. So whenever we hear in future years, because executive orders have been tracking up and up since George Washington, an executive order will begin with a question. It's almost like a 3-check list. Can the president do that? Then we'll ask the question, what's the reason? What's the evidence the president is putting behind that executive order from the Constitution, from the laws? And then are they working with Congress or another branch of the government to do that work? To see if we want to, guess for ourselves, do they have the power to do that? Can the president do that? So that's so helpful, such an easy way and like a rubric to follow when we look at executive orders. But when we understand where the power comes from the Constitution, what was the role and genesis of being a single person in the executive branch from Congress from 1787 and why they wanted that, then we can kind of balance all these ideas and see where the power comes from and where there's limitations. I love that. And I also just love the zone of twilight because it's fun. So thank you so much. That was a great summary, a great tool we can use moving forward. And thank you so much for that.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Great comments in the chat, URL, you're winning. Thank you, Cunningham class. Nice to see you guys too. And very cool, very fun. Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Cool. Okay, Tom, I will see you in an hour and 15.
Sounds good.
Have a good one. Bye.
Bye.